Hello, everybody. Welcome to this, to the Philological and Pedagogical Studies into the First Century National and International Science, hosted by Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. So I'm very glad and honored to be allowed the opportunity to record and share some of my knowledge in this online conference. So my topic is making language assessments more empathetic. So I'm going to share some strategies that I use to implement when I work at different testing companies, such as Harcourt, Pearson, ETS, etc. So my name is Luis Perea, and I am a lecturer of bilingual bicultural studies at the University of Texas at San Antonio in the US. So anyway, basically I'm gonna go over a little bit over the theoretical background over this, and then I will give you some examples, practical examples that you can use for your own contexts. So let me talk about principles of universal design, or something that is called UDR in language assessments. So notice here, these illustrations, they represent different people, right? People with different needs. Okay, so people with disabilities, physically challenged people, perhaps people who may be blind or color blinded, people who may have a hearing impairment, speech impairment, etc. So this is very important for our students anywhere in the world, right? So let me talk about universal design first. So basically this is a concept that has started in architecture, and it has been expanded to other fields such as the arts, healthcare, mainly education, and has to do a lot with environmental issues, recreation. So think about, for instance, handicap parking, right? So when you go to, you're in a city and want to access a building, there is specific accommodations for this, for certain people, right? So this is what universal design is all about. Why is this important, okay, in the field of learning? Okay, so let's define first what is universal design for learning. So it is the design of instructional materials and activities that makes the learning goals achievable by individuals with differences in their abilities to see, hear, speak, move, read, write, understand English, attend, organize, engage, and remember. So basically, this is the core of universal design for learning. So basically, the design of instructional materials and activities to have equal access to all of our students, right? Okay, so it has a great potential to affect the design of classroom assessments and classroom instruction. So we as teachers, we do a lot of these accommodations in our day-to-day basis in the classroom, but what about assessments, right? We need to implement that as well. Also, in this case, it can be applied to address the, in this case, different educational policies and laws, at least in the US, and I'm sure in some other countries, like in Ukraine, there's, this push to make sure that all the students learn and have equal access, right? In this case, I'm just alluding to what it was NCLB, No Child Left Behind, right? So new assessments can be designed and developed from the beginning to allow participation of the widest possible range of students. So this is the core in terms of assessments for students, to allow the participation of the widest possible range of students, okay? This has to be with increasing accessibility. So when we think about tests or exams, examinations, assessments, even quizzes, we're talking about test questions, right? So in this field, we call test questions, we call them test items, okay? So the test questions or items should have specific characteristics. In this case, they have to be inclusive of all types of students, including students with disabilities and English language learners, okay? Also, they have to minimize extraneous cognitive, sensory, emotional, and physical barriers. So we need to avoid any information that could pose a problem to students with different skills and characteristics, right? Whether it's cognitive, sensory, emotional, or physical. So test questions have to be non-biased and avoid creating barriers through lack of sensitivity to disability, diversity of culture, and subgroups. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to share with you a checklist that we used to do, and I'm sure big testing companies such as Pearson, such as ETS, Educational Testing Service, companies that create the IELTS, the College Board, etc. They follow something similar. So this is a checklist I used to implement as a test developer, content specialist when I work in all these companies. So the following slides show the topics included in the accessibility review checklist. Okay, so the checklist helps ensure that all text and art are free of unfair advantage or disadvantage to any subgroup. Okay, so let's start. So the first principle is precisely define constructs. Okay, so basically what it means are the components of the learning target or objective that is being assessed. Okay, so constructs are clearly defined so that all construct irrelevant cognitive, sensory, emotional, and physical barriers are avoided. So if you're not familiar to what a construct is, so a construct in an assessment is everything that we are testing. So we'll create an assessment for writing and we want to assess students' ability to use, for instance, spelling correctly, capitalization, punctuation, paragraphing in a writing test. So those are the constructs that we are testing. So if I am designing a test of writing, I shouldn't be having students read a lot because the idea is for them to write and not to read, right? So that's what it says. Constructs are clearly defined so that all construct irrelevant cognitive, sensory, emotional, and physical barriers are avoided. So the test questions or items should measure what they are intended to measure, not anything else. All extraneous, unnecessary information and graphics should be removed. So this is what we mean by precisely defined constructs. So if you are testing math, you should be testing math, not reading or listening, right? If you are testing listening comprehension, you shouldn't be testing math or writing per se, right? Okay, let's go to the second principle, which is language appropriateness. So words or phrases that are ambiguous, sexist, racist, or otherwise offensive, inappropriate, or negative to any subgroup should and must be avoided, okay? So again, think about our English language learners, think about our students. They come from different backgrounds. So for instance, if you're teaching students in Ukraine, if they're Ukrainian students, we need to be aware about their linguistic performance. Obviously, their use of English may not be perfect or may not be that of a native speaker of English. So we need to be aware of that. If you are teaching in an environment with multilingual or actually multicultural students, for instance, in a university or in a school where you have English language learners coming from different countries, let's say Ukraine, let's say Azerbaijan, let's say Kazakhstan, etc., from different countries, then we need to still be aware of the linguistic ability, right? So what does this mean? When we create an assessment, the words, phrases that are ambiguous, sexist, racist, or otherwise offensive, inappropriate, or negative need to be avoided. So in universal design, a variety of plain language guidelines ensure comprehensible text. So plain language means if we design a test, if we are using a passage for reading, if we are using instructions, or even the test questions, they have to be straight to the point, unambiguous, and not complex, right? So they have to be, yeah, it's basically straight to the point, simple. So this has to do with the idea of language and vocabulary. So how does the language has to be? So the structures, the syntax of our assessment, the test questions, the passages we use, has to be clear, concise language, high frequency vocabulary, simple sentence structure, short sentences, scarce pronoun use, active voice. So again, remember, we're testing language. So depending on the language proficiency we are testing and the level, we need to be aware of that. Vocabulary. So the vocabulary has to be appropriate to the grade level you are testing. So you're not going to be using university words with maybe middle school students, right? Has to be at the right grade level. High frequency, non-colloquial, okay, non-idiomatic. They have to have a single meaning. You know that there's vocabulary or even phrases that have double meaning or multiple meanings. So what you may understand in a specific vocabulary or phrase may not be the same to another person, right? So we need to make sure about that. And simple tenses, okay? The next principle is called gender stereotypes. So what this means is that all groups of society should be accurately and fairly portrayed. So think about this, when we have taken the TOEFL test, for instance, we may see in the illustrations or even in the content of the passages, content of the reading, etc., maybe all men or all women. So there has to be a balance in gender. So we have to include males and females, okay? The next one is ethnic stereotypes. In places, countries, or even schools or universities which are multicultural, we need to make sure when we design our assessments that we need to avoid ethnic stereotypes. So what is this? Unnecessary and improper references to ethnic, racial, or cultural groups should be avoided. Okay, so we should be avoiding stereotyping a specific ethnic group, for instance, in the US, African Americans, or Hispanics, or Asians, etc. So we should avoid any stereotypical phrases. Let me give you an example. So some people who are not in contact with, for instance, people of African descent or African Americans may think that African Americans are good at playing basketball because they're African Americans. So no, so that's an stereotype, right? So we need to avoid that. The next principle is cultural familiarity. So texts or art that assume a shared cultural experience should be avoided. So presentations of cultural or ethnic differences should neither explicitly nor implicitly rely on stereotypes nor make moral judgments. So just a quick example. Here you see a picture of a football player. So let's say that I am a teacher in the US, I teach ESL, and in my classroom, maybe I have a lot of students coming from maybe Africa, for instance, who have never ever seen an American football game. So if I am testing, and in my tests, I use content of American football, they may not be familiar with that particular cultural piece, right? Another example, if I live in, for instance, in Ukraine, and you know that in Ukraine the winters are very cold. People in Ukraine are accustomed to the snow. For instance, if I have a student from a warm climate, or a student who doesn't know about specific cultural characteristics of Ukraine, he or she may not be able to answer the question correctly, okay? So cultural familiarity. What else? Socioeconomic bias. So content to which any socioeconomic subgroup may be sensitive should be avoided. So for instance, imagine that I am a student from a low socioeconomic low socioeconomic level, and then I go to the classroom, I am being tested with some content that has a lot of, that makes me feel uncomfortable. It would be, for instance, expensive toys or expensive houses, things like that. Then I may not be acquainted to that with that specific context, right? So we need to avoid this socioeconomic bias. Geographic bias, and actually the example of the snow, it is a good one. So all geographic settings, urban, suburban, rural, should be fairly represented. So if you are designing a test in which maybe you have illustrations, pictures, videos, and you have a rural setting, make sure you also have an urban setting so that students can be, can relate to both types of settings. So if I live in a rural setting and I see a context in which there's a lot of technology, a lot of the urban life, I may not be acquainted to that. On the other side, if I am a student who lives in a very urban setting and I have never lived in a rural setting, in a farm, etc., and if I am being tested with some content or context around that, I may be at disadvantage in the test, okay? Also, this is something that sometimes we don't look at as teachers, especially if we create our own assessments, appropriate graphics. So art is suitable related to the text. It should provide support to overall comprehension of the text or the question, and is legible and appropriately placed. So if you are going to use a picture, a video, an illustration, a graph, it has to be related to the text. It should be part of the text, not just an addition or a decorative part of the text, right? So we need to avoid clutter and simplify. We need to focus on relevant parts and omit details that are decorative or distracting for the student. Use consistent and recognizable representations. So if you have a test of 80 questions, let's say you are testing math, for instance, and you have a specific style in the graphs that you are using, and then you change the style and again, it's not consistent, right? Use bold or enlarged headings, so make sure your headings are visible and understandable. Avoid narrow columns, avoid unnecessary shading. Sometimes we tend to use graphs or illustrations, pictures, which have shading and they're difficult to even distinguish, right? Use the highest possible contrast for shading. Now, this is important because in some cases, the tests, or at least in large scale assessment, the tests that are created, they may be gray. So think about a student who is blind, in which the test is going to be gray. So the student needs to be able to touch the illustrations to figure out what is being presented, right? Or think about a student who is colorblind. If you use a lot of colors in a graph and you're testing the color in a graph, it may not be fair to students who are colorblinded because they may not be able to distinguish specific colors, right? So be aware about that. Also, considerations for special populations. So all groups of society are accurately and fairly portrayed. So stereotypes related to any particular disability or language ability should be avoided. Consideration must be given to maximum accessibility for all students, including English language learners and students who are visually impaired, hearing impaired, learning disabled, significantly cognitively disabled, or even physically challenged, okay? So this is very important. So in other words, if we're testing our students, we need to take into account the different populations of students we may have. We may have a student who is colorblinded. We may have a student who may not know, who may be dyslexic. We may have a student who may have a different disability. So we need to make sure everybody, to the extent that we can have access to the test that we are using, right? The next principle is sensitive topics. So these are controversial or emotionally charged content that could be part of a test. Okay, so let me show you a list so that it would make sense. So some of the sensitive topics to avoid are, for instance, death, unless you are teaching explicitly a social studies class and maybe you're going into, for instance, the Second World War, and you are covering, for instance, the Holocaust. Take into account that in that context, you are teaching that, you already are preparing the students, you are already giving some background information, historical background information. So you are preparing the students in the classroom, so they have a lot of time to process that information, right? But it shouldn't be, it's not a good idea to just include in a test content that has to do with death, right? Illness, birthdays, holidays. You may be thinking, why birthdays and holidays? Maybe not in certain countries, but for instance, in countries like in the United States, where we are very diverse, we have a lot of different people from different countries, people with different religious beliefs. So for instance, some students or some populations may not be acquainted or comfortable with the idea of holidays. So a holiday, if I am including a holiday in my test that is not familiar with the religious beliefs of another person, of another student, they may not connect to that, right? Things such as abortion, gambling, luxuries. This has to do with the idea of socio-economic bias, so avoiding content where there's a lot of luxury, expensive cars, expensive houses, brands, etc. Evolution, so you might think in evolution, why evolution? This goes again with the religious ideas, you know, some people are very, you know, they're very strong in their religious beliefs and may not accept evolution and vice versa. So avoiding these types of content in a test. And again, all of this is to avoid in a testing situation, not in a classroom situation. Sex, the occult, violence, abuse, any kind of abuse, murder, suicide, politics, okay, religion, tobacco, alcohol, poverty, expensive brand names, recent natural disasters, weight and height of people, disrespect for authority figures. So all of these very important topics to avoid in your assessments if you're designing an assessment, right? Let me switch now to I want to give you some examples. So we can see how this practically applies. So let me make this a little bit bigger. So typically in this type of workshop, I will have my teachers break out into groups. I will give them a specific set of sample questions, which have been modified on purpose so that they can figure out what kind of principle is being used, so they could correct it. So again, these are the principles: precisely defined constructs, language appropriateness, language and vocabulary, gender stereotypes, ethnic stereotypes, cultural familiarity, socio-economic bias, geographic bias, appropriate graphics, considerations for special populations, and sensitive topics. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna show you some sample items, and then I'm gonna allude to these constructs so that we can identify them, okay? So I have a passage here. It says, look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. Okay, so I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger here so you guys can see. So let's see. So Donna Ashlock, a 14-year-old girl from California, was very sick. She had a bad heart. Donna needs a new heart, her doctor said. She must have a new heart or she will die soon. Felipe Garza, 15, was worried about Donna. Felipe was Donna's friend. He liked Donna very much. He liked her freckles and he liked her smile. Felipe didn't want Donna to die, okay? So you can start seeing, there's a bias problem in this little passage, right? Let's look at the test question. What will Donna's parents most likely need to do to help her? So she needs to see a cardiologist, she needs to see a neurologist, she needs to see a gynecologist, she needs to see an optometrist, right? So first, what I can detect, and you probably are thinking about this, so some of the bias problems that I see here, definitely sensitive topics, because here we have a little girl who's sick. She may not make it. So we have, disease, sickness, and also look at the test question. What will Donna's parents most likely need to do to help her? So cardiologists, neurologists, gynecologists, optometrists. Look at the language, okay? So imagine that this is a test question for a 4th grade level student or 3rd grade level student. Look at the vocabulary. So ask yourself this question: do you think the student will know what is a cardiologist, neurologist, gynecologist, optometrist? So the vocabulary is too high, maybe too high for this level, okay? So something to consider. Let's look. So the type of bias is, of course, sensitive topics, and it's also vocabulary, so vocabulary bias. Let's look at another example. So here we have, look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. Discuss with your colleagues your rationale. So let's see. Sophia wanted to enroll in a soccer team at the university. She has seen a lot of her male classmates play soccer, and she was excited to the possibility to join her local team. She visited a soccer school in the USA. She was amazed to see different ethnic groups such as African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanics, and white Caucasian. When she went to talk to her coach about enrollment, Mr. Mironenko said, "So sorry, Sophia, right now we cannot accept girls in the men's team because we don't have an all-girls team. Soccer is very tough sport for girls, maybe next year," okay? So think about the bias and look at the pictures. So here, notice that we have a team and they're all male, okay? Here we have another team, but they're all male. And yeah, here we have a combination of, you know, white Caucasian and, you know, Black descent players or African American, assuming the team is, actually I think it's the team in England, looking at the symbols. But look at here, we have a group of children playing, but notice that they're all male children, right? We don't see any girls playing soccer. So let's look at the couple test questions here. What should Sofia do after Mr. Mironenko's advice? A, go complain to the dean of the department, forget the idea about the possibility to be part of the soccer team, start her own local soccer team at the university with other girls, wait until next year when more female students can enroll in the team. So you can see that none of these choices are even fair, right? I mean, they don't fit. What can we infer about the photos in the passage? So again, looking at the photos, right? So only ethnicities such as African Americans, Asians, and Hispanics are good to play soccer, or team sports like soccer are not good for female students at Sophia's university. Team sports like soccer at the school level cannot be gender mixed, or only white Caucasians should play a contact sport such as soccer. So looking at the test questions, looking at the pictures, and looking at the context of the passage. So definitely we see gender stereotypes in this passage and pictures and test questions. Okay, we see gender stereotypes. We also see ethnic stereotypes. So, you know, stereotyping white Caucasian versus African descent or African American players. So very interesting, even sensitive topics. So here, when in the context, Mr. Mironenko said, so sorry, Sofia, right now we cannot accept girls in the men's team because we don't have an all girls team. Soccer is a very tough sport for girls, maybe next year. So the statement in itself is very, very inappropriate, right? So we see also gender stereotypes. So see, we need to be careful how we design our test questions and passages. Let's look at another example. So look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. Discuss with your colleagues your rationale. So now this is interesting, look at this. Listen to this lecture from a professor and fill in the correct missing blank. So notice that this is a lecture, so that means this is a listening test. So it says that the blank speaker had a penchant for rhetoric at the podium was understandable. He grew up the son of a pastor and spent many Sundays as a young adult preaching the gospel himself. But in his new career as an oncology lecturer, he should also have adopted a more blank use of words to fit his new role. With subject matter requiring more concentration and attention to detail, his blank had a tendency to leave his conference audiences confused and exhausted. Okay, so first of all, look at these the format of this set of questions. We have a listening task. So students are supposed to listen, I guess, and read and fill in the blanks. So here we have a precisely defined construct bias because it's not really testing listening per se, it's testing reading comprehension. Students have to read. They need to look at the vocabulary. They need to know the meaning and plug it in, okay? So it's not really a listening task per se. Another thing is testing vocabulary. So look at the vocabulary. So seeing garrulous, monotonous, blank, ardent, diffident, economical, blank, loquaciousness, concision, derisiveness. So very complex vocabulary. So I see also definitely language and vocabulary bias. So language appropriateness, language vocabulary. Also notice that when tests are designed, you hardly ever see a listening test where students have to fill in the blanks. So designing a listening test with filling in the blanks test items is not a good idea. So this would be a very difficult listening test, okay? So imagine that this is applied to, let's say, a group of high school students, and even worse, let's say if they are, if they have to fill in the blanks with so the vocabulary is very difficult, the content is very difficult. Another thing that I see under sensitive topics could be, religion, the use of religion. So here we see, he grew up the son of a pastor and spent many Sundays as a young adult preaching the gospel himself. Okay, the vocabulary such as oncology lecturer. So imagine if we were going to test, let's say, middle or high school students with this as a listening task, it would be extremely difficult, right? So we need to be careful about that. So let's look at another example here. So look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. So let me read it. Laura, a 14-year-old student, received some money from her dad for her birthday. She lives in the upper scale neighborhood near San Antonio, Texas, USA. Every afternoon, she can swim in her pool, and if she still has some energy, her dad will allow her to ride her horse in her ranch. She had about $1,000 to spend because of her birthday. Her dad told her, you can have $400 in cash and $600 from his credit card. She and her friends went to the mall and had three choices to spend her money. She could buy a brand new iPhone, about $800, a little Chanel leather bag, about $550, or 4 pairs of Nike shoes for school, ranging between $150 and $200 each. So according to the passage, what would be the best way she could get the most items with the money she has, okay? So look at the test question. So choice number one Chanel leather bag and 2 pairs of Nike shoes, 1 iPhone and 1 pair of Nike shoes, 1 iPhone and 1 Chanel leather bag, 1 Chanel leather bag and 1 iPhone. So you are already thinking, definitely we have here socioeconomic bias. So imagine that I am a student who is being tested with this test question and passage. What if I have never have access to any of these items, right? So first of all, it is very unlikely that a parent will give their child, $1,000 to spend for their birthday and, let them go to the mall and spend all this amount. And, we're talking about here, items such as iPhones, Chanel leather bags, Nike shoes, okay, which are very expensive. So if I have never had access to this, I may not even know what brands these are, right? Also notice I see precisely defined constructs. So the student, so you are thinking, what is this item testing? So the student has to figure out, what is the best way that she could get the most items with the money she has. So it's more than a language test, is a math test, right? So the student has to figure out what items are the best, okay? So very important, socioeconomic bias. So we need to avoid these sensitive topics also, expensive items, okay? So let's look at another example here. Look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. So let's see. On Saturday evening, the new international students at the University of Texas at San Antonio had the opportunity to watch their first football game at the stadium. All of the spectators started chanting for their favorite team, and it was a very fun day. In the game, students could enjoy the band, and the university's sororities and fraternities were present. The team was mainly composed by sophomore and senior students, but not freshmen and juniors. The host team won the game by scoring a touchdown and a goal. Everyone had fun. So, okay, so that's the context. Let's look at the test question. Why was probably the football team mainly composed by sophomores and seniors? So let's look at the choices. Because they have more experience, because they are the coach's favorite athletes, because they are better than the freshmen and juniors, because they are more popular than freshmen and juniors. So here what I see is, and you're probably thinking about this, is cultural familiarity. So imagine that I am a new international student, or I'm just a recent arrival, in this case to the US. I am a student either from, I don't know, Africa, from Asia, from, I don't know, a country where American football is not familiar, or maybe students haven't had the opportunity to watch an American football game on TV. Think about maybe places where students may not even have TV, access to TVs, right? And they're being tested with these test questions. So I see definitely, you know, socioeconomic bias. I see definitely cultural familiarity, unless you have at least some months in the US, or at least have watched several games of American football on TV, then you will be familiar with that. For instance, if I live in the US and I am tested with this passage with rules about other type of sports, cricket, something like that, then I may not know the rules, right? Another thing that I see, look at the vocabulary. So probably not all new arrivals to the US may know what a sorority is. They may not know what a fraternity is, right? Also vocabulary such as sophomore and senior students, freshmen and juniors. So unless you have basically live in the US and have gone to middle or high school, especially high school or college, you may know the classification of what is a sophomore versus a senior, freshman, and a junior, right? For instance, let me give you another example. When I first moved to the US and I started teaching in a high school, I didn't know really these classifications. I was not familiar. Why? Because, for instance, I was born in Mexico, and in Mexico, we don't have these classifications, right? Also notice this sentence. The team was mainly composed by sophomore and senior students, but not freshmen and juniors. Look at the test question. Why was probably the football team mainly composed by sophomore and seniors? Because they have more experience, could be. Because they are the coach's favorite athletes. Because they are better than the freshmen and juniors. So for instance, this option is very biased, right? So it has this stereotype in saying that because freshmen and juniors are new, they have 1 or 2 years of experience in high school, they may not be very successful at playing football. So this is a strong stereotype, right? Look at the next one, because they are more popular than freshmen and juniors. So see all of these problems with this question and the context, right? Let's look at another example. Look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. So actually, here, look at the picture and identify 3 items you can use at the beach. Explain how you can use them. So let's look at this. Wow, very, very busy, right? So think about students with special needs. So the bias here that I see is considerations for special populations, right? So what if I am a blind student and this test question has to be braille? So not only the directions, not only the text, but this entire illustration or picture will have to be braille. So imagine a blind student trying to figure out what these items are. It will be very difficult. Let's assume that I am a colorblind student. It will be very difficult to even recognize, these items. So this is too busy. So probably a better way to fix this illustration would be maybe just to put a few and very well defined. Okay, maybe I would put like 5 or 10 at the most separated so that the students can pick and figure out, okay, I can use this at the beach, okay? And this brings me to an experience. So let me tell you very quickly, when I was designing assessments at Pearson, at some point we were reviewing this passage. It was the story about King Midas, and it was a beautiful story, good test questions, but there was art that went along to the story, but it was extremely busy, lots of colors, lots of shading, very, very busy. It was a beautiful art, but I think it was unnecessary to the point of the passage and the test questions, right? So avoid unnecessary pictures. Okay, here. Look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. So this is a listening task. Listen to the following monologue and answer the questions. So students are going to be listening to this. Types of snowfall. So let me read this very quickly. So, okay, students, let's review our last lecture about the types of snow. And I think I have a little typo here, should be students. So here we have, a blizzard is a violent winter storm lasting at least 3 hours, which combines sub-freezing temperatures and very strong wind laden with blowing snow that reduces visibility to less than 0.40 kilometers or 0.25 miles. That's a blizzard. A snowstorm features large amounts of snowfall. A snow flurry is snow that falls from short durations and with varying intensity. Flurries usually produce little accumulation. A snow squall is a brief but intense snowfall that greatly reduces visibility and which is often accompanied by strong winds. A snow burst is a very intense shower of snow, often of short duration, that greatly restricts visibility and produces periods of rapid snow accumulation. Blowing snow describes airborne snow particles raised by the wind to moderate or great heights above the ground. The horizontal visibility at eye level is generally very poor. Drifting snow is snow on the ground that is blown by the wind to a height of less than 1.5 to 2 meters, so 5 to 6.5 feet above the surface. So imagine you're listening to this and you're trying to figure out the differences between the types of snow, right? Based on the lecture, what sort of snow will most likely occur in New York during winter? So will you have snowstorms, snow squall, drifting snow, blowing snow, or blizzard? So you're probably thinking, so look at, I see a lot of problems with this question, right? So basically, it is a listening task. It has a lot of information. The language is complex. The vocabulary is complex. Just the types of snow themselves. I see cultural bias. So unless you are familiar with miles, then you would understand it. But if you only know kilometers, so it will be a little bit difficult. Another thing that I see, so language appropriateness for listening. I see vocabulary is very difficult. Perhaps cultural familiarity. So if you live, unless you live in New York and are accustomed to the winters there, you may have a good idea about what kind of snow may fall in there. What if you live in a warm place such as, let's say, Mexico, or let's say Ecuador, or let's say Saudi Arabia? You may not be even familiar with this. So I see, so cultural familiarity, I see geographic bias, definitely geographic bias, right? Let's look at another example here. Look at the passage and associated test questions and determine what type of bias problem is identified. Okay, so read the following article and answer the questions. So let me go very quickly. Mexico City. A powerful earthquake jolted central Mexico on Tuesday, killing more than 130 people, cracking building facades and scattering rubble on the streets in the capital on the anniversary of a devastating 1985 quake, previous quake. The nationwide death toll rose to 139 on Tuesday evening, according to Mexico's head of civil defense, and the Mexican federal government declared a state of disaster in Mexico City, which helps free up emergency funds. Luis Felipe Puentes said 64 people died in the state of Morelos, just south of Mexico City, though local officials reported only 54. In addition, 36 people died in Mexico City, 29 in Puebla State, 9 in the state of Mexico, and 1 in Guerrero. The count did not include one death that officials in the southern state of Oaxaca reported earlier as quake-related. Hours after the quake, rescue workers were still plowing through the wreckage of a primary school that partly collapsed in the city's south, looking for any children who may be trapped. Some relatives said they had received WhatsApp message from 2 girls inside, but the claim couldn't be confirmed. So that's the article, right? So based on the passage, what could be some strategies people can do to avoid earthquakes? So staying at home all day to be safe during the quake, not going to war on the day there will be an earthquake, okay? Running very fast to get out of the buildings to save one's life, or staying calm and getting out of buildings in an orderly manner, okay? So definitely you are thinking what I'm thinking. So sensitive topics. So here students have to read about an earthquake, a disaster. So this would be very inappropriate to put in a testing situation. Here even I have a video. So for those who like to use videos, let me see if we still have access to this video. So let me play it.
Pues está muy cabrón. No. La cantidad de edificios que se cayeron. No lo puedo creer. No, impresionante.
So let me go back to my so sorry about that. Let me close this. So let me go back here to the. So watch the video, watch following video and answer the questions. So based on the video, what can you do if you're in a car during the quake? So first of all, about the video, that was an actual video from somebody or people who were witnessing that earthquake. I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago. It happened in Mexico City. So definitely it's something terrible to watch, to be put in a test. Imagine students who may be in those kinds of natural disasters, whether, you know, earthquakes or hurricanes, students who are running from violent places, violent environments, countries in war, and you're probably thinking, you know, I'm giving an example of what is happening, unfortunately, right now in Ukraine, with the war in Donbass and in the east. So a lot of the families and children who are being misplaced, you know, who are running away from that violent environment, and all of a sudden we give them a test that relates to that context, so that it brings them back those memories, right? So a lot of people and children could, you know, they, because they have lived those experiences, they obviously get these horrible traumas. So putting these kind of topics in a testing situation is definitely very inappropriate, right? So look at the question. Based on the video, what can you do if you're in a car during the quake? So get out of the car and get into an open area, drive very fast to get away from the earthquake, get out of the car and start running to a safe place, drive to an open area where no buildings are around. So definitely here we see sensitive topics, okay? So it would be very inappropriate to put in an earthquake. So I'm gonna close. So these are the sample items that we went over. I'm gonna say cancel, or I can just say don't save. Let me go back to PowerPoint. So I just wanna wrap up here. So test questions. So when we design our assessments, quizzes, examinations, etc., make sure that your content, your context, the exams, the passages, the listening prompts or stimuli you use in your assessments to test your English language learners should minimize barriers and ensure that all students are given the opportunity to demonstrate what they know. Be designed and developed from the beginning to allow participation of the widest possible range of students. Remember, the idea of universal design is to include everybody in the testing situation in a fairly manner, right? Be free of bias and sensitivity issues. So accessibility, principles of universal design objectives are to acquire general understanding of accessibility, apply principles of universal design, identify sensitivity of fairness issues. So what is accessibility in assessment? So it has to do with developing tests that minimize barriers and ensure that all students, including those with special needs, are given the opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge of the tested content. Remember, a test is just a sample of how much they know. It's just a little sample. So that's basically what a test should be. Accessible assessments incorporate principles of universal design based on the belief that each child in a school is part of the population to be tested, and that testing results should not be affected by disability, gender, race, or English language ability. And I'm just gonna leave you by, if you wanna know more about assessments and ethics, you may want to look at Elena Shohami's critical language testing principles and the critical perspective. So these are some principles that she has drafted And this is for both the test developers, those who create testing, those who proctor tests, and even the teachers, right? Very important. So I'm not gonna read them, but you can go over those yourselves. But things such as critical language testing asks questions about which and whose agendas tests serve. You need to ask this question: is the test good for? Is it really good for the student? Does it benefit the student, or does it benefit the school? Does it benefit the principals? Does it benefit the universities because they get funding? Critical language testing claims that testers need to understand the tests they create within a larger vision of society. What vision do the tests create? What vision and purposes are used for? Very important. When I was working at Pearson, for instance, I work with clients, heads of or directors of departments of education whose son, I don't want to say all of them, but a few of them didn't understand testing. They didn't understand students, so they have a lot of the power to make decisions, but if they don't have the understanding of their students and testing, then they can make really poor decisions. Critical language testing examines tests in terms of their measurement and assessment of knowledge versus their definition and dictation of knowledge. CLT questions the nature of knowledge, and tests are based upon whose knowledge, who's the expert, independent truth or negotiated and challengeable. So the design of assessment should not be from the top, from the principals, from the test developers, but also should come from the voices of the teachers, the parents, and the students. Let me give you a quick example. When I used to create assessments, we used to have a lot of different workshops. We used to go all around the US, train teachers to create assessments. And we have a panel called Bias and Sensibility, where exactly we would look at assessments, test questions, and we would go over these checklists. And these typically we would go and train teachers, and they typically would have a group of teachers who were trained and who would look at the test questions and determine if they were biased or not. But let me tell you something, the only place that I have seen that they have done, I wouldn't say that they haven't, it's the only place that they have done a good job, all the states have done a good job, but this to me was very interesting. In Puerto Rico, when they used to design, or they designed their English as a second language assessment for K-12, when they do their panels for bias and sensitivity, they actually invited not only teachers, but they invite parents and students to go and have a voice in how the tests are designed. So that's very important. So this is what I'm pointing out, these principles of critical language testing. So CLT asks questions about which and whose agendas tests serve, claims that testers need to understand the tests they create within a larger vision of society and its use of those tests, examines tests in terms of their measurements and assessment of knowledge versus their definition and dictation of knowledge. So very important. I'm just going over, I mark some specific ones. Encourages an active critical response from test takers. Ask questions about which and whose agendas test serves. Claims that testers need to understand the tests they create within a larger vision of society. Yes. So very important. So these are my references. Some useful links if you want to know more about testing. This is the link for the International Language Testing Association. They have also a code of ethics for all test developers. If you want to know more about that, very important. If you want to know more about publications on testing, so this is a link where I used to work at Pearson. So you can access different articles on fresh studies on language assessment. I have here some links to release items. So release items are basically test questions that have been used by different states in the US, and because they have been used, several times, they publish these test questions and tests to the public, to parents, so that they can understand better how the tests are designed. And I'm actually very proud to say that I have worked in the past in all of these projects. So you have the New Mexico Standards-Based Assessment, the NICESLAT New York State English as Second Language Achievement Test, the Michigan test, Florida, even the Abu Dhabi Educational Council test, ADEC, Arizona. And thank you very much for listening and sitting and learning about assessment. If you have any questions, you can email me. That's my personal email. So I'm glad I was able to share some of this knowledge and experiences when I design lots and lots of assessments for different companies and states. So thank you very much and stay safe. Thanks a lot.